Hey there, welcome to part 2 of my reading of my book I wrote about The Last of Us. So just a little introductory thing, because there's a little change to this YouTube version. I'm putting this out on YouTube and also as a podcast on iTunes and Spotify and all of that stuff. And for the YouTube version, for the first part that I put out before this, I made it all fancy. I put in all these video clips of say I bring up some old game. It's like, well, here's a clip of the old game, and it turned out really cool. I think it's really neat. But it was a lot of work. And of those different places, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube is just not the place where people are finding this audio. The views are pretty low, and they could pick up later. You never know. I've had that happen before, where I put up a YouTube video and just for whatever reason, the algorithm just doesn't catch it at first. And then you come back a year later and there's tens of thousands of views. You never know. That could happen. Also, that cannot happen. So that may never happen with this series, but that's fine. Whatever. If you're listening on YouTube, I'm glad to have you. I will continue to post the parts here. I'm just not going to put as much work into them. Instead of the super fancy, let's put in all the different little clips version, it just took way too long. So in order for me to get this out in any kind of a timely manner, there's still going to be visuals, but they're just going to be kind of general The Last of Us visuals, just kind of ambient visuals. I'm actually going to take probably all of them from Frico's channel. I mentioned him last episode that he got Last of Us on a PS3 dev kit, and he's just found amazing shit you can do with that game and with the PS3 Uncharted games. Just ways you can unlock stuff that wasn't meant to be seen, just deleted shit from the game and all kinds of fascinating stuff. I definitely recommend Frico's YouTube channel. Futurama Freakle is the name of his YouTube channel. But yeah, I'm just going to put his visuals on my audio because it's still interesting. It's still Last of Us related. It's actually probably more interesting. And it's a lot less work. So that's all. Visually, this is a little less fancy than before, but the fundamental audio, which is a reading of the book I wrote about The Last of Us, that's still here. That's all good. So without further ado, let's get into part 2. Picking up in Boston, 20 years later. Hey there, welcome to the Ocean Hour with Keith McNally, with the soothing seaside sounds of water against rock. So hey, my name is Keith McNally, and if you have never joined me before for this little project, I wrote a book about The Last of Us called The Last of Us: Surviving the Super Apocalypse. Hey, future editing Keith. I just splashed coffee right in my own face. Do you remember when that happened? Ugh. I wrote this book called The Last of Us: Surviving the Super Apocalypse, and I gave it that silly-ass name because the idea is I played through the game without picking up any items. It's such a crushing apocalypse that there's no items left. There's nothing to pick up. Because I wanted to kind of recreate the sense of stress and scarcity that I felt the first time I played The Last of Us to, help me kind of bear down on it. I really have to focus to make it through this game. And then I just wrote whatever thoughts I had about The Last of Us and about video games and about life. This meanders a lot. It's about a lot of shit, but principally it's about The Last of Us. So if you want to check out that book, you can get it on Amazon. If you want to throw me a few zenny, which was the old Capcom currency from Forgotten Worlds. So that alone should let you know the kind of person you're dealing with here that thinks that's a cool reference to make. Or you can just get the book for free at my website, keithcourage.com. Please go check it out, and if you think it's cool, please spread the word and let people know about it. So in an effort to spread this thing far and wide, I'm recording an audiobook version that I'll put out on iTunes and on YouTube. In the first episode, I dealt with the introductions and the options menu and shit like that. The Texas prologue, and in this episode, we get into 20 years later, Boston. So without further ado, 20 years later, Boston. I'm sorry that I'm so obnoxious. It's the only way I can jazz myself up to do this recording. If I try to read it in a serious, professional tone, it just sounds fucking stupid. Oh, and also, my usual disclaimer, the reason you can hear the delightful sounds of the ocean is that I feel uncomfortable recording in a sound booth. Feels weird, so instead I'm recording out in nature. So even if this whole project crashes and burns and no one gives a fuck, I still get the fun of hiking out to the waterfront and sitting on a barnacle-covered rock, pretending I'm in Monkey Island while I record this audiobook. 20 years later, Boston. The 20 years later title is so great. It's like a sudden slap. We knew the game took place at some point in the future, but man, that is a big jump. Time skipping. Skipping forward in time is a storytelling technique that The Last of Us takes great advantage of. After a big event, the story tends to cut to black, rather than showing its ramifications directly. That can really help difficult, emotional scenes feel more believable, as we use our own experiences to imagine how the characters are being affected. This first jump forward is the granddaddy. Henry's death or David's death do have an effect on the characters, but the words 20 years later tell you a lot about Joel. In a world where almost nobody made it, Joel survived. The more we see what the world has become, the more weight those 20 years carry. In a world where you literally cannot survive without breaking every moral law of the old world, Joel's not only broken them, he's good at it. He's so good at surviving that he almost seems comfortable. You don't come across a lot of old men in the world of The Last of Us. Joel is one of the oldest. Speaking of age, Joel seems older in this cutscene than he does anywhere else in the game. I'm always a little taken aback by the change. Maybe that's all it is, just the shock of transition. But it really does seem like he's got more gray hair here than he does anywhere else. Assuming that Joel's birthday was September 26th, which we saw on the newspaper back in Texas, then we're picking up the next day, September 27th, 20 years later. I assumed that Joel got drunk on his birthday. Tess chides him for having wanted to be alone, and I reckoned he just sat around and drank while he mourned the past. But that booze bottle's pretty full. Maybe it's a second bottle. Or maybe Joel's a sipper. Doesn't that seem even more sad? Pounding back a whole bottle of booze is one thing, but to just sadly sip tiny amounts of liquor all night while you think about the dead past, that's just sad. You know, I'm really starting to feel a relationship with this shore where I record this. When a boat goes by, I can tell how long it's going to be before a bunch of waves start smashing against the rocks and ruining my recording. I've realized I don't understand tides, though. I thought the tide was the same every day. Maybe it's because this is like an inlet, it's not the direct ocean, but I never know when I get here if there's going to be a bunch of beach or no beach. It's weird. All right, ha! As if this book doesn't have enough digressions without me talking about the boats that are going by. Societal collapse. I always question in apocalypse scenarios why human beings haven't gotten their shit together yet. It really shouldn't take this long. Organizing communities is what we do. When I was in elementary school, we organized an elaborate work project during recess where we would inefficiently try to redirect rainwater into the teacher's parking lot. We'd dig out these little ditches and try to redirect all the puddles. We tried to flood that parking lot for months, under the impression that they would then have to cancel school. We were too dumb to know that that would never work. But that organizational impulse is evident everywhere. If you look at cities from an airplane, they look like computer chips. Organizing each other is what we do. Any plague, any calamity would only be a temporary setback. We can't help but rebuild. That's the kind of creature we are. I always liked how, in the latter timeline Romero movies, society is actually coming back together. Unless the human race is utterly, utterly destroyed, rebirth is inevitable. The Fallout games are obviously a great example of this. It's especially weird in Fallout New Vegas because it's far enough away from where the bombs dropped that there's not a lot of direct damage. And it's been 200 years, but there's still just shit everywhere. Like it's clearly just sort of the aesthetics of the game. It's the style. It doesn't make any sense. It's not that hard to sweep up, to just not have random shit lying everywhere. But I do find the extended collapse in The Last of Us a bit easier to accept because of the brutality of the cordyceps spores. The airborne nature of the infection, the speed and violence of the infected, and the instant kill of the clickers all help sell the idea that human beings just can't get back on their feet. They just can't stand up to this level of battery. Boston. One might question the logic of staying in a major city in the event of a zombie apocalypse. I gotta admit, I didn't think about that, but I heard someone mention it on a podcast somewhere, and it's not a bad point. You wouldn't sleep next to a mattress infested with bed bugs. The old world significance of major cities could be part of it, but a smaller city or a town seems like a far better place to try to defend. Given the number of potential corpses spread throughout the city, trying to clear the place seems like a bit of a fool's errand. Probs with Rob. Definitely my best section title ever. Tess tells Joel that their shitty partner Robert has been being shitty, and that they gotta get Robert before Robert gets them. It really is jarring to go from Sarah's death and a worldwide catastrophe straight to problems with Robert. Who the fuck is Robert? Why should I give a shit about Robert? The first time I played The Last of Us, I definitely felt a change in the pressure at this point. These days, I find the Boston section pretty delightful, but my initial lack of enthusiasm for this section came down to 3 things. Number 1. Early game tutorializing. Perhaps a necessary evil, but it is an evil nonetheless. Number 2. An uncompelling goal. I repeat, who the fuck is Robert? Does anyone care about him? Where is Robert's mother? Somebody ask her if she cares about him. And number 3, the realization of how mechanical and systems-driven The Last of Us was going to be. Now, these are all first playthrough problems. None of these things are issues for me anymore. In particular, I came to really appreciate the gaminess of The Last of Us, and the strongly mechanical nature of that gameplay. But it is a very distinct shift from the fully story-based opening. Initially, I wanted more of that. I didn't want to worry about ammunition and taking cover. I wanted another pure hit of that sweet, sweet story. So the pursuit of Robert, the most boring man in the world, dragged a bit. The Boston streets. Tess and Joel head out into the suckiness of Boston, walking past some acquaintances of theirs. Wooden NPCs in games can really grate on me, like the citizens of Columbia at the start of BioShock Infinite. They stand stock still. They only speak when the player approaches. If you run at them full speed, they just stop you like they're statues. The NPCs in The Last of Us really aren't so different from the BioShock Infinite NPCs. They stand still, and they only talk when you approach, but here it doesn't bother me. Probably I'm just a fickle mushhead, but the difference might be because The Last of Us enforces a slower pace during exploratory sections. Joel is forced into a slow walk, so when he's stopped, unable to run into a stationary NPC, it doesn't seem jarring. It just seems like something Joel would naturally do. So The Last of Us has an I can meet it in the middle level of artificiality. The enforced walking in this first stretch is also kind of neat, because the walk animation is one you don't actually get to see very much. And the way Joel walks looks so goddamn good. Take that however you want. I'm just immediately buying into this whole experience. Like, I'm big time in. God damn, I love The Last of Us. If you were looking for an objective dissertation of this game, or any other game, you ain't gonna find it here. We walk past a line of people that are on their knees, hands behind their heads, who the guards are testing for infection. If you mess with the guards, they push you down. And if you do it again, you get shot in the head. Nice. It reminds me of old Sierra adventure games, where if you look at anything even slightly cockeyed, you're dead. Naughty Dog games are famous for having no loading screens, unless you die. Adding a percentage indicator to the loading screen wasn't such a bad idea, because this game really does take forever to load. Dialogue volume. It may be realistic for dialogue to sound muffled when there's distance or obstructions between the characters, but I kind of wish they had let that realism slide. It's fine for enemy barks to be indistinct, but I'm never gonna not want to hear what my friends are saying. It makes staying near your partner an inadvertent and not very fun game mechanic. I'm surprised whenever I have the subtitles turned on how much dialogue I'm losing to the fuzz of distance. Listen mode. Because I only had listen mode available during my first playthrough, it now seems a little bizarre that it was ever a thing. I think they did a good job with listen mode, but after being without it, the whole notion seems very unreal. During my second playthrough on Survivor difficulty, I kept waiting for a listen mode tutorial to happen, but it never came. And the game works completely fine without it. The third-person camera is more than enough to be able to peek around corners and keep tabs on your enemies. Without listen mode, the overall sense of reality and immersion feels greater, and ratchets the tension up in a nice way. If you do insist on playing with listen mode, which, come on, stop being such a little wuss, you should definitely not upgrade it. Fully powered super listening can start revealing seams in the game, allowing you to see enemies appear or disappear as they're loaded in and out of memory. I heard that listen mode was a relatively late addition to the game, and things like that do seem to support that idea. Listen mode is definitely best left behind after a playthrough or two. Involuntary movement. Our couch is quite far from our TV, so I'll often play games while standing near the screen. For a game like Red Dead Redemption, I love letting the screen fill my whole field of vision. I can kind of imagine that I'm there, like a flat version of VR. In Red Dead in particular, it can feel amazingly effective, staring out into the massive, dusty vistas of the Old West. It helps in that game not to play any missions and just to do side missions, because killing 60 natives in cold blood without breaking a sweat has a way of hurting the simulation. I also like to play The Last of Us while standing in front of the TV, and being that dialed into the experience can lead to some involuntary body movements. Without listen mode, I keep raising onto my toes, trying to see over walls. If I can't quite look around corners, my real-life head will move to the side. I can't remember doing that so consistently since I first played Wolfenstein 3D in the early 90s, trying to dodge my head away from gunfire. Which brings me to a random memory, my dad and Doom. I remember when my dad played Doom on PC. He was obsessed with not letting enemies get the drop on him. He would bring up a wireframe map of the level, which showed the position of all the enemies. Then, before opening any door, he'd study the map and decide the best way to clear the room. At the time, I thought of it as just an old guy cheating at video games. He was seemed like he was diluting the purity of the Doom Twitch Fest. But looking back, that was actually kind of a cool way to play. It's like he was playing a tactical strategy version of Doom. I also just realized my dad was playing a self-devised variant, the same way that I'm playing a self-devised variant of The Last of Us. Like father, like son. Except that my variant is way harder, rather than way easier, you cheating old bastard. Area 5 checkpoint. Walking toward the Area 5 checkpoint, one building on the horizon is leaning against another. I think that's the building where we first meet clickers. I take a moment to gander. What a dumb sentence. I take a moment to gander. I really love being in this world. The vibe, the feeling. I was a big fan of the Fallout 3 apocalypse, but I think this is my new fave. As Joel and Tess are about to pass through the checkpoint, there's an explosion! Fireflies! In the ensuing panic, Area 5 is shut down. You know, I've just noticed that I never really described who Tess is, for instance. I didn't have a section about here's who Tess is. And I think that's maybe something worth bringing up is that is kind of how I wrote this whole book is I wrote it for an audience that knows The Last of Us and knows video games. Like when I reference some old game, I don't really say what it is or give the brief byline. It's either you know the game or you can just go look it up. Because that always really rubs me the wrong way. When you read a book about video games that seems like it's written for a general outside audience, I don't like that. There's this one book about Super Mario 3. I don't remember the name of the guy who wrote it. But man, it's just, he describes each block and each character. It just seems so weird and lame. It just seems so space fillery. Who are you writing this for? And then on the other side, there is that just really sad sense that people are writing books about video games, but they're hoping that the outside world will care. And that's just no, man, no. For us, by us, you know? It's such a mood killer. If a book references Monkey Island and then they say the Lucasfilm adventure game from blah 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 starring blah blah made by blah blah blah. Everyone knows that, and if they don't know that, they can go look it up. I hate that shit. So I maybe took that a step, maybe almost even too far in this book, the fact that it's just hey, and here's Tess. Because yeah, we all know Tess. We all know who Tess is. We know what she looks like. We know her deal. It just seems like it would be weird for me to describe Tess. You know who Tess is. Until later on, I'll have opinions about her personality and her place in the story. That's when I'll talk about Tess. But yeah, it's a little odd maybe, now that I'm looking back at the book, that it's just oh, and here's Joel, and now he's with Tess, and I just never even explain who Tess is at all. But that's the way this book is. There was a deliberate choice of let's all presume that we're obsessed with The Last of Us, and we've played it way too many times, and we know way too much shit about it, and then go from there. Goddamn fireflies. So, referring to the big explosion at Area 5, in the American Dreams prequel comic, the fireflies set off another big explosion for some goddamn reason. They sure do love blowing shit up. The military may not be great, but I'm not clear about what the plan would be without them. Do the fireflies really think they have an infrastructure capable of filling that void? It kind of bugs me when people identify the fireflies as the de facto good guys in this story. Maybe those people watched too much Star Wars as kids, so they naturally side with the rebels. But in virtually all scenarios, the rebels are short-sighted, murdering assholes. I'm sure there are plenty of examples of the military abusing their position in the quarantine zones that we don't get to see. But under the circumstances, the military's harshness seems somewhat justified. During our walk to the Area 5 checkpoint, one of the lined-up detainees is found to be infected and is immediately killed. That's incredibly harsh, but what other choice is there? I'd be sad to see my friend get killed, but I'd be more sad to see him bite my balls and turn them into zombie balls, because then you get zombie dick, and then a zombie face, and then you're a zombie. So think about that, fireflies. Tutorials. During each playthrough, I see the tutorial prompt that says pressing down and X will make Joel do a 180-degree turn. I always think that I should try using it, and then I promptly forget that it's a thing. But during this playthrough, I'll try it out. A catch-22 of tutorials is that by the time their lessons become useful, they've often been long forgotten. But if a game keeps doling out tutorials over a long period of time, then they become exasperating. It starts to feel like a game has training wheels that'll never come off. Another tricky aspect of tutorials is that even if their advice is helpful, I have a hard time internalizing it. I really only learn by doing. 3 of the tutorials in The Last of Us stress that when things go badly, running and hiding is a good strategy. That surprises me to see because that is really good advice, but it's something I only realized after I learned it on my own. After I realized how crucial it is to run away during combat, the game really opened up. These tutorials are well-meaning, but it's hopeless. If I haven't listened to anyone in my real life, be they teacher, clergyman, lover, all of the above, I'm sure not going to listen to some smart-ass video game tutorial. It's nothing against you, Last of Us, just a poor student. That really is a hell of a thing. I really don't know how to solve the tutorial problem because that specific example, like, man, I think I get into it later, but I thought it was so interesting how in Uncharted 1 through 3, you want to swashbuckle. You know, you're rewarded by acting like an action hero. Not Uncharted 4, where you just got to hide in grass because that game is all fucked up. But in The Last of Us, you are penalized heavily penalized for running towards someone with a gun and acting like an asshole. What you want to do is run away and hide and act like a survivor. So yeah, to see that in the tutorial was really weird because I felt so clever when I figured it out myself. And then, yeah, it was just there. But I mean, tutorials, man, I don't know. I guess you need them, but they just wash over. They just don't work. It's a weird thing. Running. I like that combat in The Last of Us encourages running. A lot of games allow for a lot of bullet sponging, but having to run away from overwhelming odds makes a lot more sense. If people are shooting at you, then run, dude. I was proud to have discovered that strategy. Now I'm just going to say the exact same thing I just said. I don't know why I jump in with my own commentary when usually it's already in the book. Like, why don't I trust my own book? In life, discovering lessons for oneself is always the better way to learn. And that's doubly true in video games. There's a controller in your hand, you're constantly making direct decisions. Your mind couldn't be further away from ready to absorb passive information. Tutorials could definitely use better ways of integrating into games. Maybe, during the downtime, Tess and Joel could talk about their respective strategies for killing. Hey Joel, I noticed that you run away a lot. Man, that's my worst impression yet. That's because I don't want to die, Tess. This ain't some Uncharted game. I know it's not. That world is gone. It sure is. There ain't been a PlayStation for nigh on 20 years. 20 long, cold years. I don't know. Like as I've said in previous installments, there's parts that I feel like are mildly funny if you read them in a book, but when I'm sitting here saying them, I just sound like a stupid asshole. Far Cry 3 and rigid tutorials. One irony of tutorials is that I often find them to be the most difficult part of a game. Never does a game design become more narrow and more frustrating than when it's aggressively trying to teach something. Do this and do only this, or you may not proceed. Early in Far Cry 3, you have to skin some animals, then fast travel back to camp. I always try to avoid fast traveling, especially early in a game, because I want to try to build a sense of the cohesive, interconnected world that I'm in. So I skinned these critters, I jumped in a Jeep, and I started barreling over a hill. A tutorial prompt told me I could choose to fast travel from the map screen. Okay, good to know. Then I started getting warnings that I was leaving the mission area, and I suddenly failed the mission. So I went all the way back to the critters, skinned them, and jumped in the Jeep. This time I stayed on the road that goes straight back to the camp, but I failed again. That time I was livid. What the hell was going on with this stupid fucking game? I was just trying to get through this tutorial shit. And incidentally, I lose my temper pretty fast. I then realized that after skinning the animals, everything around me became an out-of-bounds zone. I would always fail unless I teleported back to camp. The game was literally forcing me to fast travel. Far Cry 3? I know what fast travel is! I've played a goddamn video game before! You unbelievable prick! There's a guy in a sailboat going by. I wonder if he feels the same way about Far Cry 3. That tutorial may have been well-meaning, I guess, but it was crazily rigid. The developers could not imagine a world in which I already knew how to fast travel, and their attempt to make sure that I knew became a bizarre torment. And unfortunately, that tutorial was teaching me a lot about Far Cry 3. Running around the island, attacking outposts, hunting sharks, making my own fun. I've rarely had more fun fucking around than in Far Cry 3. But trying to navigate my way through the narrow, rigid story missions where any deviation from the intended path meant failure has rarely been less fun. It was like playing two different games which had almost nothing to do with each other. In situations like that, I do not envy game reviewers. Far Cry 3 was somehow an A+ and an F at the same time. Man, do you remember early in Far Cry 3? I guess, again, it's tutorializing. It's like trying to teach you how to use stealth. So it's this mission where you go to a big beached tanker ship or a bunch of boats that are just like destroyed and up on a beach. And you have to sneak through the area because if you get spotted, you fail. And not only that, but again, there's this zone. If you try to circle around and approach from behind, it's very hard to do without leaving the mission zone. It's just infuriating. It's so infuriating. Who gives a shit if these guys see me? If they see me, then we'll deal with that. If I want to approach from the back, let me approach from the back. It's just so crazy, man. Like, there's so much I like about the open worldness and the flexibility of games like Far Cry, but then the mission designers are just like, nope, you do it the way I want you to do it or get out. And it's just like, dude, what the fuck is your problem? Like, what the fuck? I'm no game designer. I'm sure a lot of the shit I say is just random shit that makes no sense. But fuck you, buddy. You're the one who's wrong on this one. Crazily frustrating. Just so intensely inappropriate of just like such a clear example of a game just fighting against itself. It's like, here's the game. Here's what the game can do. Now, don't do it. Don't do any of it. Fucking, ugh. With Far Cry 3 in particular, there's mods, you can get that just open up the game as an outpost destroying simulator. And man, that's the best way to play it. Fuck that storyline, fuck those missions, fuck that character, fuck all of that. But running around the island, awesome. Kind of hurt my throat a little bit yelling about Far Cry. So, Joel's first bandage. Speaking of tutorials, Joel is forced to use the health kit Tess gives him after the explosion. He'll just stand there until you break that bad boy out. I tried only applying the bandage halfway so I could save it for later, since health packs will be rare in the super apocalypse, but no dice. Now that the checkpoint is shut down, Tess and Joel make their way through an old building, an alternate route to Area 5. The game roadblocks me until I pick up Joel's backpack and pistol, but that's reasonable. I can't play the whole game without a backpack. The pistol has 4 bullets, and I'm going to try to save them for the bloater in the school gym. I might even have to pick up some extra ammo, unless Bill throws me some. Or maybe that fight will go fine. I don't know. I'm a mother. I worry. Inventory. Joel's inventory becomes more and more improbable as the game progresses, particularly once he's carting around a homemade flamethrower. But in general, I think the backpack system is really cool. Joel's pack isn't really big enough. It should probably be one of those big hockey bags, but it generally makes sense. I won't be doing much item manipulation during this playthrough because Joel's backpack will be mostly empty. But I love the real-time inventory system. Having to dig through a bag in the middle of a gunfight is a fun mechanic, and it's a lot more immersive than just opening an inventory menu. There were very few games before The Last of Us I can think of that did the real-time inventory stuff. I guess Dead Space did it. Even when you're buying stuff from a shop in Dead Space, time didn't freeze. And obviously there's the Souls games, and that was different because I think that was more in order to accommodate the online infrastructure of those games. That pausing was not possible. But yeah, it's a really neat thing. Really good idea. Learning about ladders. There's a little triangle prompt to boost test. Surprisingly hard to say. To boost tests up a wall. I initially found that prompt hard to find since it's above eye level. In one of the developer commentaries for Portal, they mentioned that getting players to look up is a hard thing to do. I'm not sure why that is, but it seems to be true. Tess and Joel continue through the dilapidated buildings with the help of some ladder tutorials. People are really down on all the ladder and pallet puzzles in The Last of Us, but they don't really bother me. At least they're easy. I really hate when a game stops me dead to do a complicated puzzle. If the game is all about puzzles, like Portal or Braid, then that's all good. But if my mind is not in puzzle-solving mode, the shift is really unbearable. The puzzles in Uncharted 3 fuck with me every time. I'm running around, having fun, throwing grenades at dudes, and suddenly I gotta sit down and do some homework. In comparison to that, a practical task like moving a ladder is totally fine. The camera movement in this game is really great. It's something I didn't initially notice much, but it lends a sense of motion and impact to whatever Joel's doing. If you fall a long distance, Joel spends a moment on his hands and knees as the camera jars a bit. Oh, here's a typo. Gotta go fix this. It takes a moment to the camera to reestablish itself. Go fix that, Keith. It takes a moment for the camera to reestablish itself, and it works well to convey the sense of having the wind knocked out of you. Jumping. The Last of Us uses context-sensitive jumping. Joel can vault over objects or climb up small walls. But if you press the jump button while Joel is standing in a field, he won't do shit. He's not just gonna jump for no goddamn reason, and I like that. As games have become more realistic, jumping has become increasingly odd. Massive vertical leaps are the domain of Super Mario, or certain old-timey versions of Superman. But Joel's not doing any rocket jumps. His clambering is strictly utilitarian. It's hard not to notice when jumping doesn't match the rest of a game's aesthetic. While testing out the buttons in the 2013 Tomb Raider, I jumped Lara straight up and down a few times, and she looked like a bizarre rabbit person. Her running leap was fine, but her standing leap was ridiculous and didn't serve any gameplay purpose. In BioShock Infinite, after climbing from the rowboat, the first thing I did was jump. Booker hopped in the air like a box on a spring, and the screen gave a little shake as he landed. That screen jitter made me smirk. It just felt like silly legacy bullshit. Having a jump button for no reason is probably something that ought to go. I shouldn't be grinning within moments of starting an ostensibly serious game. I do quite a lot of jabbing at BioShock Infinite in this book, and partially that's because I wrote the book and then I intended to go back and write the introduction after, and the introduction was mostly about comparing BioShock Infinite to The Last of Us because they both came out in the same year, and BioShock Infinite really let me down. I really thought it was worse than the original BioShock in literally every way. There's nothing about it I liked better. And it was such a downer because I was like, when's another game like this going to come along with this kind of pedigree? And then later that year, The Last of Us came out, and I was like, oh shit, holy fuck. But it was like this crazy long introduction. But that is one reason why, if it seems like this book takes an unnecessary number of jabs at BioShock Infinite, that's because it was meant to be a through line of the book, is see how this one company did all this shit wrong, and then see how great it is that Naughty Dog did it right. But then I cut the introduction, so it feels a little unbalanced now. Scavenging. I've heard people say that they find Joel's scavenging to be distracting. A character will be trying to have a conversation while Joel is crouched in the corner, picking up a pile of tiny gears. If nothing else, it is an example of how video game fans will complain about literally anything. But I actually like Joel's scavenging. Not only are supplies scarce, but I like to think that surviving an apocalypse has given Joel a kind of survivalism OCD. A real-life example is Vladek Spiegelman from the graphic novel Maus. Vladek survived World War II and became pathologically obsessed with thrift. During the war, his life had been saved by small, seemingly inconsequential objects, so in his later life, nothing could go to waste. I should make it clear too, in case you don't know Maus, even though it is a comic book, it is based on a true story. And it's really good, I recommend it. But yeah, like after this guy went through concentration camps and every little thing, like maybe just having a shoelace or something could make a difference. So later, after the war, he would do stuff that like would never occur to you or I. Like he was living in a place where his gas bill was covered in his rent. So he would light a burner on his stove in the morning and leave it on all day at a low heat because he didn't have to pay for the gas. And by doing that, he could conserve matches, which seems so crazy. Like it's so much more expenditure to have the gas on all day than just matches. Who gives a shit? But he couldn't get over this mindset that like, what if there are no more matches? What if he needs the matches that he has, you know? And it sounds crazy, but then if a zombie fucking apocalypse happened, he'd probably be more prepared than other people. It's very interesting comic. I think of Joel in the same way. He compulsively checks every drawer, as every item could mean the difference between life and death. It's how his brain is wired, and there's no convincing him otherwise. So his companions can only stand by and watch as he compulsively scavenges. That being said, during this itemless playthrough, I'll be imagining the opposite. This version of Joel won't even bother opening drawers because he doesn't recognize their contents as being valuable. He might find a room full of supplies, but he'll act as though the room is empty. For he can see no hope. He walks the world with only the clothes on his back and whatever items people put directly in his hands. The apocalypse may have happened to the world, but the super apocalypse, why, that apocalypse happened inside of Joel's heart. If enough people want to give me a writing award, I will open a P.O. box to accommodate their delivery, so just let me know. Scarcity. Speaking of scavenging, the absurd scarcity of items on Survivor difficulty is what inspired me to do this itemless playthrough. So let's rap about that, shan't we? My stupid high 50% melee kills stat led me to realize that I didn't mind having limited ammunition. After spending enough time punching and choking, Joel's guns take on a kind of secret weapon feeling. I could pull out a gun in a pinch, but I rarely felt like I needed to. Weapon upgrades certainly seemed unnecessary. I had, of course, read complaints about the weapon sway in The Last of Us, but I think the sway makes things feel more natural. Joel is a pretty old guy. His arms should sway. A character with steely, perfect aim can actually feel off-putting. Far Cry 2, of all games, has razor-perfect aim. My character has malaria, for Christ's sake. A little weapon sway would be appropriate. Not that I'm complaining, because in Far Cry 2 you need all the help you can get. It's just weird is all. And the scarcity of items starts to seem funny after a while. Joel will eagerly open a drawer, only to stand there dumbly staring at nothing. He does it again, and again, maybe this next drawer. Ah, shit, nope, nothing, empty. The Shiv doors become particularly demoralizing because they contain such depressingly small hauls that I eventually stopped caring whether I opened them or not. Being so item deprived also made it evident how often The Last of Us will fudge a player's inventory. If you miss an item, it'll often reappear in a later location, and support characters will give Joel ammo and health when he's low. Even during solo sections, Joel will often respawn at a checkpoint with more health than he had originally. There's a lot going on under the hood to keep players on edge without actually letting the situation slip into full hopelessness. So, playing The Last of Us with successively fewer items and using guns less and less often, the question eventually became, did I need any of this stuff? Survivor difficulty is already an itemless wasteland. Could Joel make his way through the entire game with only his base stats and his 2 fighting fists? If there was a blurb on the back of the book, that's what it would be. Can Joel make his way through the entire game with only his base stats and his 2 fighting fists? Find out inside. I tried to mentally walk my way through the game, to imagine where I might really need some items. As I mentioned, I wasn't sure if I'd have enough inventory to kill the high school bloater. I'd certainly have to gather items to fight the winter bloater, since Ellie's inventory is basically just a bunch of joke books and a broken Walkman. But besides those couple of choke points, I felt pretty confident that I could do it. Like the first person to climb Everest, I felt simultaneously motivated and suicidal. Stunt gaming. The idea of playing The Last of Us without picking up items is obviously a stunt. It makes for an easy hook to describe this book, and also an easy way to characterize myself as a moron. I don't recommend anyone actually try this method, since it ignores a lot of the mechanics that make The Last of Us such a great game. But I didn't want to examine The Last of Us from a purely plot-driven perspective. The gameplay is an important part of this game's story, and I'd reached a point where the mechanics felt too familiar. I was breezing through encounters, knowing where the edges of the simulation were. I could be sloppy and still survive. My first playthrough of The Last of Us felt oppressive. After scraping through an encounter, my gut would sink at the sound of more enemies in the distance. The experience really wore me out, which is a feeling that video games don't often deliberately explore. I think that sense of desperation was intended, and it really helps illustrate Joel's world, both inner and outer. For a proper dissection of The Last of Us, I wanted to bring back the feeling of being constantly, endlessly fucked. The theory is that having no items will force me to really focus on each encounter, and to regain a sense of scarcity as I salivate over every abandoned health kit. I guess that's the kind of thing that should have been in the introduction of the book, but I waited to couch it a little deeper in. But that's like the thesis statement of the book. When we last left our heroes Joel and Tess, they were on the outskirts of the Boston QZ, trying to make their way to Area 5 after the fucking goddamn Fireflies, who I'm not a huge fan of, set off an explosion at the Area 5 checkpoint. For what reason? Who can say? Very childish organization, the Fireflies. The outskirts. Joel and Tess make their way through an old building full of beds, with names and handprints painted on the wall. Interspersed are messages like, "Don't go south," "Shoot first," "Take my advice," "Stay on the other side of the wall." It's revealed through a found letter that the infected we're about to encounter were people who were trying to get inside the Boston QZ. As bad as things are in Boston, they're apparently worse outside. I don't know how widespread a problem the infected are in the world at large. Are they everywhere, or are there just pockets of monsters? It doesn't seem crazy bad from what we see in the rest of the game. There are plenty of desolate, monster-free areas. Maybe it's the lack of community on the outside that makes things rough. Maybe getting preyed on by human raiders is as big a danger as the infected. Like the original Dawn of the Dead. You can deal with the zombies, but the biker caravan coming up the road will really fuck you up. Graphical fidelity. The graphics in The Last of Us are not just beautiful, but also easy to parse. A lot of games of the PlayStation 3 generation get visually muddy. I'm sure the PlayStation exclusivity of The Last of Us helps, allowing the full limits of the system to really be exploited. And the game's medium pace may help as well. Riding a horse is about as fast as you ever go. In a way, The Last of Us is kind of leisurely. Bayou Billy. One thing I thought about doing that I never got around to, I thought it'd be funny to make a glossary. Not a glossary, like an index for this book that would just list all the dumb references that I make. So it could say like, Bayou Billy, page 56. Just because it'd be funny to read through, because there's so many references in this book to things that don't matter at all. In that vein, Bayou Billy. Speaking of muddy graphics, do you remember this fucking game? Hey, is that a car on the horizon? Or a rock? Well, doesn't matter now, 'cause I'm dead. Fuck you, Bayou Billy. I remember there was this convenience store near my house growing up that usually had an arcade machine in it, which was the coolest thing, and a little rack of VHS tapes and Nintendo games. That's where I first saw Evil Dead 2, and I was very confused by the ending until I finally saw Army of Darkness. But I remember that's where I rented Bayou Billy. And man, the game was so fucking hard. I think that was one of the rare cases where, if I remember right, the game was actually made harder for the American market, which was usually not what happened. It usually went the other way. Like our version of Final Fantasy 2/4 was dumbed down. There's this game called Holy Diver that I rented. It was a Famicom game, so when you rented it, it came with an adapter to make it the size of a Nintendo cartridge. So fucking hard. I think I got to level 2. So that just didn't even come out here. They were like, man, Americans don't need that shit. But Bayou Billy, for whatever reason, is crushing. That's a fucking... You are a man. You are Bayou Billy himself if you can beat that fucking game. Cardio. Video game characters sure are cardio machines. Uncharted 2 starts with Nathan Drake being wounded, but he can still climb up a dangling train. His grip strength is godlike. I like how Joel, while still a ridiculously relentless dude, still feels a little bit fallible. As a human, he's still a miracle, but it does take him a moment to climb a wall, or to choke a man to death. On a video game scale, he does feel like a bit of an older man. The flashlight. I was completely confused the first time I saw the tip the controller icon. Tip my controller? Okay, I tipped it. What did it do? I use the in-game flashlight pretty sparingly, because I find the glow to be a bit severe. I'd prefer to just walk through the dark. I've also never seen a shake to recharge flashlight in real life, so I had no idea what the hell was going on. I read that the failing flashlight mechanic was a holdover from an earlier version of The Last of Us, where Joel could craft batteries. Maybe it would have related to the sugar bomb components, which have far less overlap than the other items do. I also read that if you happen to be playing without a motion controller, there's no way to recharge your flashlight. You have to reload your game, at which point the flashlight will be recharged. The flashlight's not a big part of the game, but it seems like its battery level is a mechanic that probably should have been removed. If the flashlight had limitless charge, I don't think anybody would find that weird. Still to this day, I've never seen one of these tip to recharge flashlights. I have no context for what that is or how it's supposed to work or what's in it. I guess I could look it up, but I don't know. I thought that was a weird thing for a game to just, hey, you know what this means, right? Tip your controller, recharge your flashlight. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? You know? I might be sitting on some rocks in front of nature right now, but there's an extra large McDonald's coffee next to me. I don't know about no tipping flashlights. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Here we go, monster time. The first spores. Tess and Joel come across a cloud of spores and put on their gas masks. I heard someone mention that the spores should stick to clothing, which is a fair point. But I guess it's just lucky that they don't. I like the spores as a method of infection. The bite-based infection of conventional zombies really wouldn't be enough to explain how the pandemic swept across the entire Earth. But having corpses blowed up and send out a cloud of spores really helps explain the spread. Joel comes across a guy who's trapped under rubble and who begs Joel to kill him. He's trapped in an abandoned building, infected, alone. It's hard to imagine a situation worse than that. When you're in a bad situation, it's amazing how much your mind can tune out. When you're really sick, time passes as though you're in a semi-dream. Even if you're in pain, that pain will ebb eventually and give you periodic reprieves. But when something is really wrong, the pain never abates. That happened to me with appendicitis. I thought I had food poisoning, but the pain was constant and kept worsening. I learned that what I used to think of as peak pain was just the beginning of how bad things could hurt. When you're in a situation that's eventually going to kill you, the pain gets worse than I ever understood it could. If this guy's trapped under rubble, some part of him is probably crushed. I don't know what level of pain that causes, but I'm guessing it's somewhere on the nightmare scale. He's also constantly breathing in spores, which can't be pleasant. An infection is attacking his brain. And he's all alone. Tess and Joel's arrival was very unlikely. They were planning to take the gate into Area 5. It's lucky that they're here to help put this guy out of his misery. They say depression is a chemical imbalance, that there's something depressed people are lacking. But what is it that missing chemical is actually doing? We're all going to die someday, so maybe a proper chemical balance just shields us from the reality of how terrifying life actually is. It allows us to not think about how we're eventually going to die. Having the lid torn off of the reality of life, just staring down at the bleak pointlessness of it all, that must be how depressed people feel. And that's got to be where this guy is at right now. But I'll probably need these bullets for later, so I leave them. Sorry, dude. Fuck you, dude. Turn into an infected and be trapped forever. Fuck you. It's a super apocalypse, buddy. I need bullets. I need them. Not gonna waste my fucking bullets to shoot you, you fuck. Doubt. I'm heading to my first encounter with the infected. I'm gonna have to get real good at these since I won't be picking up any health items. Restart encounter will be my friend. I considered not using the restart option and just sallying forth in whatever shape I happen to be in. But that would soon whittle me down to a sliver of life, and the situation would become functionally identical as trying not to get hit, because I just couldn't get hit, forcing me to restart as soon as I take any damage. Running on an empty life bar would also leave me without the option to brute force my way through a tough situation, if the need arises. So I'm going to restart encounters with impunity until things go just right. But even having decided that, I feel a bit nervous. What if I can't do this? I haven't felt this way since my first playthrough, and actually not even then. I didn't have any doubt that I'd eventually complete the game. But without picking up items, who knows? Maybe I'll grind this whole situation down into some unwinnable mess. So the difficulty is back, with a vengeance! Oh, I knew this part was coming. Let me take this opportunity to discuss difficulty settings in modern games. See, this is something that was really weighing heavy on my mind when I wrote this book. I became a convert to playing games on hard, like big time, with like a religious fervor. Which I do still feel that that's the best way to go most of the time. But in the time since I've written this section of this book, I think I've chilled out a little more of like live and let live, whatever, play how you want to play. But at the time I felt this was very important, so this is quite a long screed about difficulty in video games. I haven't read it in a while. Hopefully it's not terrible. All right, settle in. Let me take this opportunity to discuss difficulty settings in modern games. This topic is fairly hot button among gamers. If you play on normal, you're a wuss baby, and if you play on hard, you're a fool masochist. I've heard all of the very nuanced arguments, but I've got some thoughts. You ready? You ready for Uncle Keith to clear this all up for everyone once and for all? Too easy. I've felt lately that playing games on harder difficulties adds tangible positives to the experience, and The Last of Us brought that idea to a head. Playing The Last of Us on normal difficulty clearly changes the experience, to the point where I can tell what difficulty someone is playing on by the way they describe the game. It's frustrating to hear criticisms like, "You can blast your way through this game," or "My immersion broke because my inventory filled up." Those things only happen because the game's difficulty is set too low for a person with a lifetime of video game playing experience. I do think Naughty Dog misbalanced normal difficulty somewhat. Scarcity is a very important part of The Last of Us, and normal difficulty is littered with items. But I understand why it happened. Modern difficulty modes are a concession to an unfathomably large and nebulous player base. Attempting to cater to such a demographic is functionally impossible. There's always going to be someone for whom even the easy mode is not close to easy enough. So I can't really fault Naughty Dog for making things too easy. That line is blurry at best, and probably not realistically measurable at all. It's really up to a player to know where they fall on the difficulty spectrum, and I believe that most players radically underevaluate themselves. Failure as a gameplay mechanic. Video games have changed a lot since their inception. Originally, games didn't need a difficulty selection. Arcade games were solely about the challenge of that game's mechanics. Frequent and habitual failure was an accepted part of playing any game. You weren't supposed to succeed. The point was only to see how long it would take before you lost. Rather than focusing solely on a mechanical challenge, modern games are more commonly about a storyline. There's a presumption that since a player has paid for a game, they should be able to see that story through. The fundamental expectation has changed, to the point where frequent and habitual failure is not expected to be part of the gaming experience. Players want their progress to be constant, and anything that impedes that progress is seen as a failure of the game's design. As a result of that changed expectation, normal difficulty has functionally become easy difficulty. I know that's something which combative online wags say in an attempt to shame their fellow gamers, but I also think it's true. A common sentiment is, normal difficulty is how the developers want me to play, so that's how I play. But I don't think that's what normal difficulty is at all. Normal difficulty is intended for people with middling motor control. It's designed to be easy enough that players won't return a game to the store. Normal difficulty is not intended for those of us who've been playing video games our whole lives, who listen to gaming podcasts, or who read books about video games. Normal difficulty is intended for the masses. The only teacher is pain. See, I thought I could make this long rant easier to read if I broke it up into many peculiarly titled sections. Playing The Last of Us on normal difficulty really fucks things up. The experience of desperate combat and the sense of being in a broken, resource-starved world go right out the window. The balance of story and mechanics becomes something a player only receives a vague impression of, rather than something the player is aggressively experiencing. As an example, I watched my friend Craig play through the Pittsburgh Hotel on normal difficulty. He was spotted by enemies and ended up hiding at a choke point, shooting every single enemy and leaving them in a big corpse pile. I feel like I did that wrong, he said. Craig didn't intend for that immersion-breaking situation to occur. He was just trying to survive, and the absurd result was a function of playing on a lower difficulty setting. On a harder difficulty, he could not have survived that situation. He would have died and would have had to re-strategize. But on normal, virtually any approach can lead to a fudgy victory. Playing modern games on lower difficulties is often problematic in this way. A player ends up in a metagame of what they should do because the game itself is unequipped to punish anything but the most blatantly incorrect behavior. Easier difficulties allow a player to progress through a game without fully learning and applying that game's systems. In The Last of Us, when a fight is going poorly, a player won't learn that they should run if they can overpower a building full of enemies. Instead, they'll stumble through the encounter, surviving against all reasonable odds, and won't feel compelled by the situation or satisfied by what they've accomplished. Instead, they'll have a sense that something has gone wrong, but without a clear guidepost as to what that error is. I think that's why a lot of players left The Last of Us thinking that the game mechanics felt sloppy. As the game piles more weapons and items onto the player, It's entirely possible to play through the whole game without really learning how the combat mechanics work. Joel can push his way past any situation, no matter how outnumbered he is. The stealth system acts as a casual side mechanic, rather than as an arbiter between life and death. On harder difficulties, when a player loses control of a situation, they will likely die. That failure then forces a player to reevaluate their strategy and to experiment with new techniques. Progress will feel earned rather than feeling rote or inevitable. The game will have a more clear metric for success, similar to those arcade games of yore. Older games may have been frustrating, but they did not feel arbitrary, and they did not feel loose. Older games, no matter how bizarre their surface conceit, always felt crystal clear. Playing on a higher difficulty setting can make newer games feel that same way. Dead Space. An example that comes to mind is the original Dead Space. On hard difficulty, the necromorphs are not that much harder to kill than they are on normal difficulty. A prepared player will have no serious trouble taking them out. The main difference is that on hard, if the necros get the drop on old Isaac, Isaac will not survive. He'll die horrifically and will endeavor to learn how not to have that happen the next time. Conversely, on lower difficulties, if a necromorph gets the drop on Isaac, Isaac won't die. Instead, he'll find himself in the awkward situation of trying to shoot the enemy from close range, or worse, he'll find himself using his awkward melee attacks. Both of these situations feel strange and unreal, and are very unsatisfying. In alien movies, no one goes around punching the aliens. That's capital A, alien movies, because obviously Will Smith did in fact punch an alien in the face in a lesser franchise. Dead Space's game engine is not well suited to close-range situations. So when Isaac is ill-prepared, but makes it through a close-range battle, it doesn't feel like an exhilarating near-death escape. Instead, the player moves on to the next encounter knowing that things did not go well, and that in a fair and just world, they should be super-duper dead. That feeling grows each time until playing the game feels more like a disconnected chore than it does a vital experience. The enemies don't feel like enemies. They feel like increasingly abstract speed bumps. Gaming esteem. Muddling through low-stakes combat in The Last of Us is a similar situation. Players aren't pushed to exercise their mind and reflexes, and instead are given a pass for something they feel like they didn't truly accomplish. After a while, a player stops feeling like a true participant in the experience. It might sound a little silly to say, but I think situations like that cause a gamer's self-esteem to suffer. Their gaming esteem, if you will. Instead of experiencing a series of skin-of-their-teeth, heart-pounding escapes, the game gives players a virtual shrug. It shuffles them off to the next encounter, where they stumble forward, again and again, until the game's finally done. I'll admit, I was initially afraid to play games on harder difficulties. My friend Matt encouraged me, insisting that I'd have more fun that way. But I was worried. I didn't want to face the personal shame of not being able to do the things that he could do. How could I show my face after admitting that hard difficulty was too hard? It's best just to stick with normal and never have to learn of my own shortcomings. But eventually I steeled my nerves and I bumped up that difficulty setting. Situations in games suddenly became pass-fail rather than pass-pass. And I found that I started drawing from the skills I'd accrued from a lifetime of game playing. It was like moving out of my parents' house or getting my first job. I beat my first game on hard, and my gamer esteem grew 3 sizes that day. I don't even remember what game it was, although it may have been BioShock 2. Not sure. But I don't even remember what game it was, but I remember the feeling of crossing a threshold. Games came alive in a way that I hadn't felt since I was a kid. Now I play every game on harder difficulties, and it's always amazing. No, of course it's not. Sometimes playing on hard difficulty is a total drag. Some games don't strongly support multiple strategies, so higher difficulties just leave you stuck, banging your head against a wall for way too long. In those cases, it's no big deal to drop the difficulty back down. Sometimes I go all the way down to easy and I just content tourist my way through a game that I don't really give a shit about. But I don't start out that way. And in a well-designed game, playing on hard really does make a difference. I discover strategies I would never have tried otherwise, and I have crazy heart-in-my-throat moments that can only come from being pushed out of the nest. Be cool or be roadkill. These fucking chapter titles. Developers really aren't thinking of us when they balance games for normal or easy difficulty. If you're a professional game reviewer and you play games on normal, then you gotta quit doing that. Those modes are for people who are missing fingers, or who are high all the time, or who still need babysitters for when their parents go out to get high all the time. It is our responsibility not to damage games for ourselves by defaulting to those lower difficulties. Normal difficulty is normal person mode, and you are not a normal person. You've spent your entire life obsessed with video games, and I know that's true because you're listening to this book. Hard mode is the mode for you. You can do it. I believe in you. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve what you want, Cameron. And if hard mode sucks, just drop the difficulty back down. It's no biggie. But that small act of going into the menu and selecting hard, it feels pretty goddamn good. Guaranteed. Or your money back. That was a joke I made because you can get this book for free, but now that I've put it on Amazon, no, you cannot have your money back. Yeah, man, fucking, I don't know what to tell you, dude. Trust me. Trust me. There's so much strategizing and so much mental acuity just waiting inside you, just waiting to be expressed through the medium of playing video games. But I mean, what is a video game if not a simulated survival situation? So try to survive, man. Pitch yourself against something legit. Give the game the tools it needs to kill you. And then you kill it. You get it? You understand? Yeah, it's so much better. It's a corner I am very glad that I turned. Well, that wasn't so bad. That was an okay little essay. Now, back to the game. The first infected. Alright, we're fighting our first group of infected on survivor difficulty. With no pickups. Yeah! Hardcore! I know the infected can't see light, but it still feels weird for me to leave the flashlight on. There's a note on the loading screen insisting that light is safe, but I can never take that fully on board. It just feels more comfortable to fight the infected in the dark. The fight goes super poorly, and I get spotted immediately. But Tess shoots the shit out of everyone, so I don't take any damage, and that's good enough for me. Melee in The Last of Us. I love using melee attacks in games. In the Uncharted series, my endgame stats are always about 50% melee. Even in a game like Killzone 3, which is not known primarily as a close quarters game, my end stats were about 50% melee. Shooting seems so impersonal. I want to get right in there and just punch a guy in the mush. My Last of Us melee stats are no different, so I ended up doing a lot of melee experimentation. It's a surprisingly robust system, considering it consists mainly of mashing one button. The encounters are mainly timing based. Whoever gets the first hit is generally the winner of that skirmish. It sounds simple, but getting that first blow on a charging infected can be a real kick in the dick. Multiple enemies, different weapons, and the varied environments all cause a simple mechanic to become varied. A high level of situational awareness is required for successful melee combat in The Last of Us. I'm not looking forward to Ish's stronghold, I can tell you that. That section where Joel and Sam team up, that place is teeming with infected who are all super psycho. There's no way I'm getting through that shit without taking some damage. Oh, here's another section called The Outskirts. I never noticed that before. 2 different sections called The Outskirts, but there are a lot of sections in this book, and to be fair, in both of these, Tess and Joel are on the outskirts, so we'll call this The Outskirts 2. After a successful round of monster murder, Joel and Tess leave the Spore Zone. We find a note left by some guy's brother, explaining that his group was trying to get into the Boston QZ but got infected. So, those are the guys we just fought. Rest in peace, losers. Somehow I missed that note on all 3 of my previous playthroughs. I later noticed that in the chapter menu, the game lists how many lore items remain in each area. That was when I went searching, and I found that this note is not even remotely hidden. It's just lying there. It's weird when little parts of a game just completely elude you. After Joel reads the note, he and Tess talk about it. It really tickles me when that happens, because the lack of similar interactions was something that distinctly annoyed me in BioShock Infinite. AI companions. I like drawing comparisons between The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite because they're such close contemporaries and attempt so many similar things. BioShock Infinite's plot was not for me, mainly because it was so shitty. But small moments could be interesting, like the voxophone where a bounty hunter killed some would-be assassins in the very room where Booker and Elizabeth stood. That was spooky as shit, listening to the voxophone at the very scene of the crime. I turned to Elizabeth, but she had nothing to say. She was just trotting around in that dumb little animation that she does. I was already struggling greatly to feel invested in either her or Booker, and that moment felt like a real letdown. While I'm complaining, did you notice that BioShock Infinite has fall damage? Booker can fling himself from a skyline and fly 60 feet through the air, landing completely unscathed, but if he falls a fraction of that height, he takes a big chunk of damage. It's like nobody gave a shit at all about that game, which is bizarre because I know that they did care. But at points like that, it seemed like they were being borderline aggressive about trying to keep a sense of cohesion from getting anywhere near that game. I feel like I could make a whole book about all the things I hated about BioShock Infinite. It's still shocking to me that people liked that game. Man, to me it was just one problem after another that just kept compounding and building and just getting stupider and stupider until the end when it was just ultimately stupid. But as fun as it sounds to write a whole book about how you hate something, I don't think that's a sustainable plan. But hey, shit's not perfect in The Last of Us either. The AI characters get in your way a lot, especially in the early Boston sections. They'll quickly hop aside when they're blocking you, and I guess that's about the best they can do. A little hand on the shoulder, I gotta get by animation would be cool, but that'd probably cause more technical hiccups than it's worth. I wonder how weird it would feel if you just passed through your companions. Probably pretty weird. But there's just no gameplay benefit to bumping into each other. It's a question of what breaks immersion less, phantom companions or hopping companions. That'd be a baffling choice for the option screen. Hopping companions? Yes, no? Enemies mainly ignore the companions in both Infinite and The Last of Us, and that's clearly for the best. Companions need to be around for plot reasons, and if they can help the player occasionally, that's great. But a fully vulnerable, plot-centric companion is a problem that video games are still nowhere near cracking. Shantytown. Joel and Tess keep traveling. There's my update on The Last of Us's plot. Joel and Tess keep traveling, and I was always a little fuzzy about what this run is about. We go outside the wall, then back into the city. Turns out it's real simple. Area 5's gate was closed due to the explosion, so Joel and Tess had to sneak around, giving the checkpoint a wide berth. Somehow, while in the flow of the game, that simple trip seems kind of arbitrary and convoluted. I'm basically just going where Tess tells me. The overgrown areas outside the wall look beautiful. Nature reclaiming civilization is definitely a big part of this game. No time to dwell, though, because we're heading into a shitty shantytown, so let's check that out. If you watch the guy who's cooking the rat, he'll eventually give it a little flip. That's also beautiful in its own way. There are two guys fighting in a little pit fighter ring, and surprisingly few people watching them. Must be the low season. The guys across the way are just sitting playing cards rather than watching the blood sport. If junior high school taught me anything, it's that a fight draws a crowd. That's about all it taught me. So did junior high lie? I mean, man, maybe it didn't teach me shit. This place really is filthy. That's a common critique in Fallout 3 as well. I know it's the post-apocalypse and everyone's living on the ragged edge, but it's been decades. Can't you clean up a little fucking bit? Oh, what's that sound? Is that a train coming? Time to take a break. Alright, for the eagle-eared among you, this is a new recording day. I got driven away yesterday by the klaxons of the train warning. A big train came and parked, but the "be aware there's a train" sounds were continuous from that point on. Today, there is a big ship being loaded or something, so that's, you can hear that grumble in the distance, and it's raining a little bit. It's very light, and I'm under a big tree branch, so I think it'll be okay, but sometimes you can hear the gentle pitter-patter of a raindrop landing on this recorder, so hopefully we don't get any of that. All right, back to where we were, in the shantytown area of the Boston QZ. This place is filthy. Maybe you'd act a little less savage if you weren't constantly grappling with tetanus. Paint some nice flower patterns on stuff, Kaylee style. Being on an apocalypse budget doesn't mean you have to live an apocalypse lifestyle. Do a little spring sprucing. I don't know if that's a real term, but it should be. Spring sprucing. You'll look better, you'll feel better, and maybe people will be slightly less inclined to eat your face. Some guy stops Joel, but then apologizes when he sees Tess. Joel asks, "Who's that?" And Tess says, "Just some old headache." It's not clear how long Tess and Joel have been together, and maybe it hasn't been too long. That guy might have been the previous Joel. Tess definitely keeps her men whipped, current and ex alike. Whoosh! That's a whip sound. Not saying that as a criticism, by the way. It's fun to be whipped sometimes, you know what I'm saying? Tess. My initial impression of Tess was that she seemed peculiarly attractive for an apocalypse survival scenario. Naughty Dog, as with all video game companies, are no strangers to good-looking characters, and Tess seemed to be drawn from that uncharted pretty person tradition. I thought of her as more of a placeholder for who the real person would actually be. I do that a lot when I'm watching movies. To me, these beautiful people are just stand-ins for the actual character. For example, Natalie Portman's character Sam from the movie Garden State. She's a quirky, boyfriendless paralegal who just falls into Zach Braff's life. That scenario feels a lot more believable if Sam is plain Jane than it does if she's Natalie Portman. I walked past Natalie Portman once in New York, and man, just like shit, dude. Yeah, it was, and this was back in 2008 or 2009 when I lived in New York, and I was dating this girl, and we were just walking through Manhattan, and Natalie Portman was walking her dog. And we both, we kind of, walked past her and didn't react, but as soon as she was past, we both looked at each other like, did you see that? Did you fucking see that? That was Natalie Portman. It's not the first time I met a famous celebrity person. I met Ben Affleck, I guess, was the first one back in 2004, 5. But yeah, both times it's quite surreal because it really does feel like you're just in a movie. It's just like, whoa, holy fuck. It does not feel like just a regular run-of-the-mill person, let's put it that way. I'm sure there are people that are already offended by this opinion, that I'm classist against beautiful people or whatever. And probably I am. What did I listen to all those Marilyn Manson songs for if not for this? And as if anyone who's listening to this is good looking. You and I are in this together, ugly, so fucking relax. My friend Matt asked me what I expected of Tess. A woman with a buzz cut and a hook hand? And I said, yeah, kinda. The art of sleevelessness. One thing is certain about Tess. Her choice of clothing is ridiculous. I feel that way about every zombie story. If you're traveling outside the wall of a quarantine zone with the potential of running into packs of crazed, violent monsters who can kill you with a single bite, wear some sleeves. Get a leather jacket, a turtleneck, something. Bare arms are zombie farms. Didn't your mom ever tell you that? I thought everyone knew that. Hired goons. A group of Robert's goons saunters up, all tough guy-like. One of them threatens Tess, and she shoots said goon in the face. That dude had a mother, maybe some siblings, and now he's dead? Yeah! Fuck that guy. Tess's actions are supposed to be read as, Tess is tough. Tess is no nonsense, and she is not afraid to use violence. But Tess as a character really did take a couple of playthroughs to grow on me. Because how this reads to me is, Tess is crazy. Shooting someone in the face is literally the worst way to finesse any situation. If you push that hard against society, particularly a post-apocalyptic society, it is going to push back. And you're not going to make it. Society will push until you die. Joel says, "You know Robert's expecting us." And Tess says, "Well, that'll make it more interesting." So, there's literally no plan. We're just going to brute force our way toward a guy who has a bunch of people waiting to kill us when we get there. These Boston parts of the game really do feel a bit off the mark. I mean, I get that this game is about a very harsh and brutal society. It's about doing whatever you can to get the advantage over other people, who are just as desperate to get the advantage over you. But walking deliberately into a violent situation when you're outnumbered by people who are expecting you, and who aren't particularly afraid of you, is not a realistic way to achieve that goal. That's battling against all odds of reality. Forgive the denigrating term, but that is some video game shit. That's Rambo shit. And not First Blood shit, but 80s lunchbox rocket launcher shit. But again, with the devil's advocate, maybe Tess has learned that planning doesn't matter. Maybe the world is so violent and so random that playing the angles isn't even worth it. Luck might be the only thing worth relying on, so just go in guns blazing and keep your apocalypse gnarled fingers crossed. That's pretty shaky sounding, but if I had to find a way to justify her actions, I'd go with that. Two angry men. After Tess shoots the one guy, his two friends get pretty mad. So we gotta fight him. The amazing tacticianship of Tess. I try to move toward a guy who's aiming a gun directly at me, which will always get you shot. I know that, but I do it anyway, so I have to restart the encounter. It takes a few tries to make it through unscathed, and this is only two enemies. I'm starting to think that this ultra-hard custom playthrough might not be real easy. The shipping yard fight. Next up are a half dozen guys spread throughout a 2-story warehouse. I spy an enemy who's walking up some stairs as though they were a flat ramp. Maybe enemies always do that, not walking up each individual step, but I've only noticed it here. It's a weird little taste of how video games change. Until recently, I wouldn't even have expected a character to properly interact with stairs. I remember actually, after I played Uncharted 2, I was watching my friend Matt play one of the Witcher games, probably Witcher 2, on his PC, and I just remember, even though the graphics are beautiful in Witcher games, just the way Geralt was moving, and he was doing that shit, like, you know, when he ran upstairs, it just didn't look right. It's just a guy locked into an animation that didn't really change, compared to how Nathan Drake, you know, touches walls and pushes his way through crowds, and all the animation is so fluid. And I love, like, if you take kind of a large fall in Uncharted and then reload your gun, the way Nathan will still do his little scramble of trying to get his balance, but reload his gun at the same time. Like, it's all just so smooth and so beautiful. And I remember just saying, like, what's going on with this fucking Witcher game, man? Like, this kind of looks like shit. Because, like, once the bar has been raised, then it's been raised, you know? It's just, it's weird to look at stuff that looks shitty after that. Obviously, The Witcher completely redeemed itself later on. And I'd say that kind of technical fidelity didn't really continue to pay the same dividends for Naughty Dog games. Like, I was really, that classic thing everyone says with Uncharted 1 of like, whoa, the wetness on his jeans goes up to the proper level on his pants. Crazy. And yeah, Uncharted 2, 3, The Last of Us, all beautiful. Where Uncharted 4, as I mentioned before, really just felt like it let me down so hard. Just a really boring plot. The characters didn't feel right to me. The storyline was slow and plotting. The game was way too long. Just a boring game. And the one thing that it maybe could have hooked me with would be the graphics. And a lot of people commented on it. They're like, oh, the graphics, it's so beautiful. But I just didn't feel that anymore. Like, the difference between Uncharted 4 and other games just isn't enough. You know, it's just not enough of an improvement for me to give a shit. It's like, all right, so maybe it looks a little bit better, but there's no reason for me to plod through this fucking boring-ass fucking game. Just for it to look a little better than everything else. But that is an interesting thing with Naughty Dog games. I think I talk about this at the end of the book, like way at the end. But that used to be such a thing when I was a kid, of like, the new graphics, and graphics were so important, and you'd get those times when you just couldn't believe it. Like, I remember when I first saw King's Quest 6. It doesn't seem like anything special now, but at the time I was like, this is unfucking believable. Look how this game looks. And I felt that way a lot with the Naughty Dog PS3 games, but just not with Uncharted 4. Just didn't give a shit. It's just more trees and leaves and water and shit. Know what I'm saying? Probably not. You probably love Uncharted 4. You probably think it's the best game ever made. And listen to this. It's the sound of waves, but then it sounds like a little xylophone as the water recedes because of all the shells on the beach. All right. This is my first chance to really break out the stealth mechanics. Time to sneak up on some motherfuckers. One-on-one combat. The stealth combat in The Last of Us feels weirdly plausible, despite the fact that I'll choke out about 300 people on a given playthrough. This game is about isolating enemies and taking them out one at a time. There's not necessarily that much in the way of combat mechanics. It's mostly about isolation and timing. Can anyone see me right now? Do I have time to choke this guy out before someone does see me? But even if he gets caught, Joel is a grizzled veteran. In a one-on-one fight, he's gonna win. That makes sense to me. A technically superior fighter is always gonna beat a sloppy one. So if Joel can get the drop on his opponents, maybe he could kill that many people. It's not likely, and the numbers are obviously inflated for gameplay reasons, but the combat is so careful and so methodical that Joel's victories feel surprisingly plausible to me. Joel's choking arm sure must get tired, though. It'd be cool if there was a stamina meter, and when it was low, enemies would start to break free of Joel's grip. The stamina meter was a cool thing in I Am Alive, and I'd love to see that system implemented in a game that I didn't hate. It's funny because I wrote these early sections, some time ago. I barely remember the game I Am Alive. But I felt strongly about it at the time, that I strongly hated it. Serial killing. In regards to Joel's huge body count, I was reading a Wikipedia list of serial killers listed by number of victims. It's pretty fucking bananas to describe something horrifying with inappropriate levity. What a dickhead sentence. To describe something horrifying with inappropriate levity. Sometimes I don't like reading your writing, Keith. I don't like that you wrote some of these sentences and now I have to read them. Now I sound like a dickhead. Why would you do that to me? There are people who have killed one or more... God, immediately the next sentence sucks. There are people who have killed one or more people a week 4 years. That might be the worst sentence. There are people who have killed one or more people a week, 4 years. 2 uses of the word people, week and years. This is just awkward, man. All right, let's just go with it. Come on. There are people who have killed one or more people a week for years. We're very lucky that the vast majority of people are disinterested in serial killing, because when somebody decides to go for it, it really confirms that society is an illusion. We're all playing along, pretending that we live in a safe and controlled environment. But if you decide to not follow the rules, reprisal can be a ludicrously long time coming. Like I said, you can kill a person every week, and society is a net so loose that it just never catches you. Those super severe cases, by the way, are, usually in like South America, or those crazy fucking Russian cases. It's not as nuts in North America, but we got our fucking problems. On that highly creepy note, let's get back to discussing this murder simulator. Carrying corpses. I'm okay with how you can't move bodies in The Last of Us. It would only offer a minor tactical advantage, and it would probably add an extra hour of playtime that was comprised of nothing but mechanical tedium. I think it's to a game's credit when it knows where to draw the line, regarding what systems are and are not important. My stamina meter, for example, is probably really dumb. And, again, I would mention that the stealth grass in Uncharted 4, super dumb. If you play on crushing, you really have no choice but to use this dumb grass where you just wait in the grass because there's no way to call people really to where you are. And then you can just kill like 8 people in this grass and no one will understand what's happening and no one will ever catch you. And if you don't use the grass, you just get fustigated. The gunfire in that game, it's like the bullets are like water from a hose just spraying on you. It sucks. It's terrible. It's not well thought out. Whereas in The Last of Us, it's very well thought out. It's weird too when you realize how much time you've put into a specific silly little mechanic in a game, and you don't notice because you're just playing and you're just doing it as you go. And then all of a sudden you realize how much time has gone into it. Like, I probably mentioned this somewhere else in this book, but I played Red Dead Redemption for 100 hours or whatever. I did tons. I like the side quests better than the main quests, and I just played that game like crazy. And then at the end, when it gave me my GTA-style stats of everything I'd done, I was in that Deadshot mode or whatever it's called, where you do slow-mo aiming, for 8 hours. 8 hours of my life was spent doing that shit. And it's like, holy fuck. I wish you had not told me that. That's insane. Footfalls. I've heard people say that with big subwoofers, the clomp, hear that clomp? The clomp of your companion's feet is overly loud. I can see how that would be very annoying and distracting. It probably would have been best to keep the companion footfalls silent. In general, as I believe I did mention before, people don't seem to notice when a game is lacking a sound. But they do notice when a game is hammering out a sound inappropriately. Bethesda games are brutal for that. The repetition of dialogue or ambient sound is incredibly noticeable and distracting. One of the first mods you're always going to see is make dogs bark at 50% volume or something along those lines. But if those sounds were omitted, I doubt that anyone would find that weird. Less is more, video games. Less is more. I was just thinking about how many sounds I ignore in my day-to-day. I'm at a coffee shop, as I write, obviously, not as I speak, where I'm in a beautiful beach. I'm at a coffee shop and I'm ignoring the staff talking. I'm ignoring the traffic outside. I'm ignoring the music. I'm ignoring the little snapping sound that the keyboard on my phone makes as I write. But in a video game, players are hyper-aware. They have to listen carefully for any audio cue that might signify danger. So bathing the environment in all the sounds of the real world is way too much. It becomes exhausting to listen to. Granted, as I said, I'm quite sensitive to sound. I always sleep with earplugs in. I even put my headphones in during movie trailers because they're so bombastic. So I'm an extreme case. But with sound design, it seems much better to err on the side of caution. Still battling the shipyard goons. It still feels weird every time I leave an item behind. The first time through a game is about doing whatever you can to exploit the game's systems in order to ensure survival. The second time through might be a bit more about experimentation, since you no longer fear facing abject, total failure. But to just leave everything feels bizarre. Leaving the bricks and bottles still hurts the most. They've always been a huge part of my combat strategy. Christ, I miss them. It's a shame that the combat in this game didn't sink in for everyone. On my first playthrough, I admit that it didn't quite come together for me either. But the more I understand it, the more I find it remarkable. The way these enemies move around, the way the situation is slightly different each time, the way that after 1,600 murders the game can still surprise me. That's pretty amazing. The developers mentioned in the Grounded documentary that the combat system came together late in the process. They said that for a long time it wasn't very fun. Making enemies act smart usually meant making them be ruthlessly, absurdly efficient. Due to the complexity of designing a game, they just had to press onward and hope that things would fall into place in time. Obviously, each person's mileage varies, but the game really fell into a sweet spot for me. And that reminds me of the Double Fine Adventure documentary about the making of Broken Age. It's really good. I really recommend it. I liked the documentary more than I liked the game Broken Age. But I remember Tim Schafer was describing what it's like in the final months of putting a game together when you've been working on all these parts and all these different teams working on different things. And you're all collaborating and you all have a general sense of how what you're making is going to fit together, but you can't really know how the whole thing's going to work and how the whole thing's going to feel until right at the end, which must just be so terrifying. Like you're just in free fall for years and then you just hope that it all comes together. And he described it as like each piece that you make is just like a little speck of color drifting down through the air. And then you just hope that when they all land, they make a beautiful picture. Terrifying, man. Game development must just be a nightmare. You know, a goddamn nightmare. It is amazing that these things ever turn out. I guess people say similar things about movies, but I am of the opinion that movies don't turn out ever. They're so bad. They're just so bad. You know, even good movies are so bad. There's something very wrong with that process, but video games sometimes it really works. I must be falling into a fisticuffs groove. Now let's return to trying to read my awkward writing. I must be falling into a fisticuffs groove because I get all of these guys on the first try. Tess is uncannily aware of the exact moment when we've cleared the area. She leaves cover and announces us safe. Maybe she's an X-Man. It's a handy power. Chasing Robert. Now we spy Robert slinking away and have to take out another half dozen of his hired goons. I'm having a hard time not being seen, but the enemy AI is pretty easy to scramble. Once you run away, they stay alerted, but they move around so slowly that it's functionally similar to them being unaware. I should have mentioned that in the moving bodies part, that's obviously why moving corpses isn't so important in The Last of Us, because there are the three stages that an enemy can be in, either completely unaware of you, actively fighting you, or having lost track of you. And yeah, once they've lost track of you, they get pretty dumb. It's very similar to what they behave like before they've seen you at all. So that's why it doesn't really matter if they see a corpse. It doesn't really matter if they know you're in the area. You can really easily just reset things and scramble the situation by just getting out of everyone's sightline. It's interesting to see how game design decisions work together. Once enemies have lost sight of Joel, they do become notably passive. Being spotted is not at all like a Metal Gear Solid Death Combat gangbang. The human enemies in The Last of Us are relatively easy to reset. Hence, the mechanic of moving enemy corpses can be omitted. It's not a huge observation, but it's just neat. Video games are neat. I have to be careful not to pick up items while I'm trying to grab someone. I had to restart the encounter because I accidentally picked up a 2x4. No, Joel! This is a super apocalypse! I'm not gonna have you carrying around a 2x4 for the entire game. That wood's not even there. That wood rotted away long ago. You crazy fuck. I clear the area in a few tries and discover my first shiv. I look at it longingly, but don't pick it up. Stay strong, son. Super apocalypse. A funny little muddle called Robert. In trying to add a sense of reality to this quest, Robert is not much help. That's another odd sentence, but what I'm trying to say is he's not a realistic character and he does not feel like he fits cohesively into an apocalypse world. He's apparently a major player in this town, a serious gun runner. He can mark you for death, hiring tons of people who will put their lives on the line just to protect him. But upon meeting Robert, he fires his gun wildly, yells a few things, and then throws the gun at us. I'm amazed he didn't slip on a nearby cream pie and go careening headfirst into a manure wagon. Robert's a fucking jerk-off. It's tough to divine much of anything about Robert, making him unique among Last of Us characters. Settle down. Everyone else has some little window into their personality, something that lets you at least speculate about the larger context of their lives. But Robert is just some shitty guy. One note written by a hired goon mentions that a shipment got hijacked, and Robert talked out a truce with the hijackers. But the goon suspected that Robert may have arranged the whole thing. So Robert either has a knack for diplomacy or a knack for large-scale fraud. And either skill could be impressive. I might even be able to develop some respect for Robert if he didn't throw a gun at me. There must be a greater reason for that gun throw. It's so out of character for this game. Maybe it's to make it expressly clear that you can chase after Robert without seeking cover. Robert won't take potshots at you because he's out of bullets. It's a little inelegant, but that sounds pretty plausible. Catching old gun-throwing Robbie. We corner Robert, and Tess asks him where the gun shipment is. Robert pulls the old, no hard feelings, right? Robert really is like a stand-in for an average video game character. In other games, that'd be a fully acceptable line of dialogue. Here, it feels like a lead weight, and it's certainly something that a man in Robert's situation would not say. I'm really getting tired of trying to justify Robert. Thank God this dude's about to die. Even while pinned down by local psychopaths Tess and Joel, Robert still doesn't want to narc on the Fireflies. Those Fireflies, man. There's definitely something creepy going on there. And he's dead. Joel literally does not bat an eye at Tess shooting Robert through the head. Sure, Robert did try to kill them, and the plan was to kill him right back. But you'd think Joel would at least flinch for a second. Human life really does not mean shit to our good friend Joel. Joel Bad. The hand-wringing some people did about the ending of The Last of Us really did seem misplaced. They made me do things I didn't want to do. They put blood on my hands. Oh, Lordy, I didn't want to kill those doctors. I wanted to do good. I wanted a choice. I think some players are frankly delusional about the kinds of characters they've been controlling in games for all these years. Joel, as a video game archetype, is not unusual. In fact, he's the archetype. A handsome, muscular, brown-haired white guy, who is also a wanton murderer. The difference is that Joel doesn't suddenly get treated like some kind of hero at the end. But let's discuss that more at the end. Or at random times throughout. Whenever the fancy overtakes me. Alright, cool. Marlene's introduction. Robert gives way to Marlene, the wanted sign featured leader of the mythical Fireflies. I initially found Marlene to be another fairly generic character. There are a lot of those kicking around Boston. Later characters fill smaller and more intimate roles, where Marlene is basically the Last of Us's equivalent of a celebrity. That may be the trouble, that Marlene can't be separated from the Fireflies, a group which already carries a somewhat unrealistic weight in this world. But as the figurehead of that fairly fanciful unit, the character of Marlene could definitely be worse. By the end of the story, she comes into her own. Regarding the deadness of Robert, Marlene says, "I needed him alive." I can't do voices. I got no voices. Later, Tess will mention that she and Joel weren't Marlene's first or even second choice to escort Ellie. That makes me wonder, was Marlene going to arrange an escort through Robert? The military is trying to flush out the Fireflies, and Ellie needs to escape the city immediately. Marlene is in a tight spot. But using Robert, gun-throwing Robert, seems like poor problem solving. He threw a fucking gun, for Christ's sake. He's an idiot. Surely using Robert would be a much worse choice than giving Ellie to a psychopath with a daughter complex who will later murder the Fireflies' entire lab team and potentially doom all of humankind. Okay, alright, maybe Robert wouldn't have been so bad. Speaking of psychopaths, Joel sure does scratch the back of his head a lot. It's like he's in some damn anime. Or maybe he has lice. Joel runs around with Tess and Marlene a bit, then fights some soldiers. It's pretty creepy to grab an enemy and not choke them out right away. They quietly ask not to be killed. It's quite a courtesy that they never call out to their friends. But I guess a gun to the head might do that. I wonder, how predictable are people? If you hold a gun to the head of 100 individual people and tell them not to call out, maybe none of them will. These serial killers should really be keeping better notes. I want to know these things. Don't just go into a frothy, red-tinged murderer rage. Bring a Newton or something. Get some stats. Companion AI. I've read a lot of comments about the bizarre behavior of companions in The Last of Us. Honestly, that's not something I notice much during my playthroughs. But it does happen here, with both Tess and Marlene bumping awkwardly into a soldier who remains oblivious. To be fair, it happens because I'm trying to perform an outlandish sequence break, bringing my companions much deeper into enemy space than they would normally be. I wonder if glitchy AI could be another consequence of playing the game on lower difficulties. Easier gameplay allows for a less measured approach to be taken by the player, which then leads to more overlap between companion and enemy pathing, and subsequently, more visibly erratic behavior by companions. I barely know what I'm talking about here, but that seems like it could be a thing. Maybe it's not entirely coincidental that I rarely noticed unusual behavior from my companions. Because I'm a hard man who plays on hard difficulty. I'm not running around all crazy, throttling the systems of some poor game that hasn't been given the tools to resist my haphazard behavior. I feel like I didn't really explain that as much as I should have in that passage. But yeah, I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, if you notice the AI people in The Last of Us doing a bunch of weird shit, maybe it's because on a lower difficulty, you yourself can do a bunch of weird shit. You can just get into situations that don't make sense. You can fudge your way through stuff. You can just be in awkward scenarios without strong reprisal, and hence your companions will be able to do the same. Whereas if you're just creeping along, if you're playing very slow and very carefully and very methodically because it's super hard, and as soon as shit gets wacky, you're just fucking dead, then you're probably not going to notice as much weird stuff out of the companions, right? Right? I think that makes sense. All right, we're at Ellie's introduction, so I think that is an episode. Call that an episode. So let me reiterate my little spiel, and as I said at the start, this book is called The Last of Us Surviving the Super Apocalypse, and you can get it on my website, keithcourage.com. If anything, the book is actually probably better than this audio recording, because, I don't know, maybe my natural obnoxiousness is less evident in the book, but then maybe not. I don't know. You decide. So that's all for now. KeithCourage.com is the website. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back with the introduction of Ellie.